from the CyberHub bunker and studio. You're tuning in to the CyberHub podcast, Tech Corner. And now, join me in welcoming your host and CISO, James Azar.
Hey folks, welcome to this week's Tech Corner numero dos for year 2021. I got an awesome guest, one of our proud new supporters of the podcast that I'm very happy to have here on Tech Corner this week. We're going to have a great conversation. So a big shout out to our sponsor of today's podcast, Whistic. And joining me is none other than the founder and CTO of Whistic, Juan Rodriguez. Juan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited. I'm grateful for your support. And for those who haven't checked out what Whistic has done with SolarWinds, which we're going to get right into, below, if you're listening or if you're watching us on YouTube or if you're listening on your favorite podcast listening platform, if you look below, there's the link and it says whistic.com/SolarWinds. Go check it out. It's a quick form evaluation. Juan will talk about it later in the show. We're not going to get into it. This show's not about selling you guys anything. I just want to bring that up because we're going to start talking about Whistic and Whistic and SolarWinds. And I want to talk about the SolarWinds thing. The link is right below. You can check it out. Also, please make sure to subscribe to our podcast. If you're watching us on YouTube, subscribe, turn on the notification bell. We do appreciate your support there. And if you're listening on your favorite podcast listening platform, make sure to subscribe. Give us a 5-star review. That always helps us push up in the ratings. Proud to say that this week I got our ratings this morning, and we are the number 7 technology podcast in the UK, folks. So that is not without your help. Every time we break a little record, I get super excited and I run in my house and I go, yeah. And then I come back to reality and go, our work is not done. So we still have a lot more stuff to talk about. So today, Juan Rodriguez is joining me. We're going to talk a little bit about SolarWinds and the software supply chain. Juan's the founder of Whistic, and we're going to talk a little bit about what drove him, because Juan had a pretty good life before he decided to become an entrepreneur. The guy was really successful working for some really big name companies, building some awesome technology, and he somehow decided that all of that was going to be put aside and he was going to go on an adventure, and why he did all of that. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And really what today's all about is understanding the software supply chain. Okay, that's something where, because of SolarWinds, a lot of people are talking about it. I want to lay some of those myths that you're hearing about to rest, stuff that we talk about on our practitioner brief each and every single day. And I also kind of want to share some best practices from an actual practitioner, a guy who deals with this every single day. And that's Juan. So Juan, just a brief intro to our audience about a little bit about yourself, if you don't mind.
Let's see. So my background is software engineering. I'm originally from California. I worked at a few startups there before I came here to Salt Lake, Utah, to continue in software. Moved up to architect, management, and then eventually started Whistic. Don't want to give too much away. I mean,
no. We're leaving that Whistic story to the very end, because right. I want people to tune into that, because it's really an awesome story. The team over at Whistic, Jonathan and Tom and the other Jonathan, by the way, your marketing team full of Jonathans. You guys
have a lot of Jonathans and a lot of Mikes.
Yes, you do. You guys have to do something about it. So if you want to get a job at Whistic, folks, #InfoSec hires, just change your name to either Jonathan or Mike, and you're pretty much almost guaranteed a role.
And let's face it, Juan is like John in Spanish. So there you go.
Yeah, it is. That's exactly my point. Like, I'm glad you pointed it out. I was hoping that subliminally it would get pointed it out. But let's talk a little bit about SolarWinds, right? So a massive, a very sophisticated attack. Let's not call it what it's not, right? It's a sophisticated attack on big targets, but it's not WannaCry. So WannaCry was a sophisticated ransomware on a lot of small people, and it had a lot of quantity, but the quality was beaten pretty quickly. This was a very targeted attack, but a very, very high quality attack. Talk a little bit about kind of your impressions of what you know so far about SolarWinds and how you're kind of seeing it and how you're addressing it yourself.
Yeah, the way I'm seeing it is it was a bit of kind of like the slow burn, right? They knew what they wanted to do, so they went in there. They took their time, and I think the other big part of it that people have to understand is that I bet they weren't, quite frankly, specifically targeted initially, right? They just kind of go down the chain. They look just all the way down. How can they slowly access them? We've seen similar things kind of with the Target breach, maybe 6, 7 years ago. Um, so so I think that the most important thing people can take away from this is you have to know your vendors. You have to know what data is being processed by those vendors, what kind of access those vendors have, and take action accordingly. Um, I think I guess my main point is a lot of people are kind of focused on SolarWinds, and obviously it's important to do that, but I think they're one of many that are being targeted, right?
Yeah, I mean, SolarWinds is just one aspect of it. And the focus on it, I think, is a bit. I think the focus on SolarWinds is mixed. And what I mean by that is we're focusing on like, wow, look at all the people it impacted. And I'm looking at it from someone whose company was impacted by SolarWinds, right? As look at how sophisticated it was.
Right.
Because the sophistication level of SolarWinds to me is extremely, extremely fascinating. You talked a little bit about, know who your vendors are, know that what data they process. And I think all of that's legitimate. We do that with our third-party vendor management, right? But it
Right.
feels like what SolarWinds kind of did is it went from, hey, all these Excels, all these forms you have people fill out aren't really, they're never really going to tell you the truth because all they are is very superficial, right? They don't really look at the engine. It's like taking your car to a mission. It's all very superficial in emissions,
Yeah, it's
right?
what depth. Yeah, the depth.
Right. I can take a car into emissions and get it to pass, and then no, if no one looks at the engine, I could have taken off the carburetor and unrestricted the car and made it street illegal, right? Which is very popular, by the way, in the regions you're in, Salt Lake, Denver, LA. Like souped up cars is a thing, and so that's one of those where emissions don't really look into the inside of the car. And so the same applies with our vendor management kind of thing, where does it really matter what data they process if their CI/CD pipeline is flawed or infected?
Well, yes and no, because in it at least helps you focus in on which path to go, right? If you know they only have access to, say, I don't know, marketing information, right? Semi-public information. At that point, okay, I don't need to go too deep down that path. But if they're actually affecting your system, integrating with your system, modifying your system, now you're really looking at something, and that's when you need to know kind of what depth you need to analyze them, what kind of communication you need to have, and on top of that, you get into like incident response, right? I don't know how they did with their response, but at that point, you kind of know how what SLA do I need with this vendor? When do I need to know about potential attacks? What should I be aware of? Like in this case, where because of the attack, people are having things installed on their system. Like the sooner you know about that, the quicker you can act, right? So it really pretty much the VRM is really about knowing where to focus, right? It's knowing about who should I focus on, because if you don't even know that, a lot of people and mostly smaller companies, they really don't know their vendors, right? They think, oh, I have 3 vendors because I'm on AWS and I'm using X CRM and Y phone technology. When really, if you actually looked inside your system, you'll see all the integrations your engineers have made, right? All these API integrations. People think it's just data being passed around, but not always the case, right? There's read write. There's all these things, and if you are not aware of all these things, then you don't even know where to start. So So that's the way I look at it. At least, from my expertise, what I have to talk to others about when this SolarWind came up, we had to talk to our vendors, and we had to talk to our customers about how to reach out to their vendors, and so that's really the things I focus on.
So
at least from educating
right,
perspective.
from an education standpoint, you can only do so much, right? And we're also relying on other software. There's I don't want to make it seem hopeless. It's not hopeless, right? It's just a matter of we got, I don't want to say we got caught with our pants down, but I think like we didn't feel like an attack this sophisticated with this level of exposure was really possible. I think this has been, I think if you and I did a tabletop on this scenario a year and a half ago, would be like, yeah, but this would never happen.
Yeah, and that's part of it. Is I think that we forget that within the process there's people, right? And that there you get into security training, you get into alerting, but I think part of it is, and again, I don't know the ins and outs of this attack, right? But my understanding is there probably were cases where people could have been alerted to it, but it's hard to say. People either become complacent, or maybe there's too much alerting, and people just get used to seeing, like quite frankly, like me, I get 100, 200 Slack messages a day. So now we have other people to look at the alerting Slack messages. It's like you gotta make sure you have the right people in place, and make sure the training lets them know, like, hey, these specific messages or alerts you have to pay attention to, right?
Yeah, I mean, you brought up a great point here, which is alert fatigue, right? And part of what happened, and again, like you said, there's not enough information, so we're not assuming anything. But if we speak hypothetical, if one of the biggest challenges of cyber in general, right, of security in general, is alert fatigue, because every device everyone tries to sell me one. Look, it's a single glass pane. It's everything you want. It's all the alerts. It's and I'm like, we don't want any more alerts. I don't want any more alerts. You want actionable intelligence.
Yeah.
Right? And it seems like at times the industry is really focused on more alerts and not really kind of comprehending the actionable intelligence piece. And that's what creates a challenge, because if I'm vetting a vendor, right? And if we talk a little bit about, supply chain, I can only vet a vendor so much. Especially if it's not a security vendor, right? If it's a marketing vendor or an operations vendor or a financial vendor, those guys aren't going to sign contracts that gives me carte blanche to audit them and audit every part of their development at any given point period in time. You wouldn't sign that contract, neither would I. So what do you think are some of the solutions that we can look at in terms of securing some of this stuff, and also allowing for greater transparency for people who use other people's, software within their environment that could potentially be extremely damaging?
Yeah, quite frankly, I feel like the privacy space is kind of ahead of the curve on this. You look at like GDPR, and they have something called a DPA, right? A data processing agreement, where you're essentially have an agreement where if you have that agreement in place, those people will tell you who their processors are. So now you're getting more into kind of the chain, right? Your vendor chain there. You have an agreement of how quickly or what information they'll provide if there is in fact a breach. And just they'll kind of explain how your data is being used. So in those ways, obviously that's for privacy. So it's really focused on PII, but really that model is kind of there. If you kind of expand that into security and kind of bring that out to discuss services, essentially you get into the service layer of that, then I think you have something there.
So let me get your opinion on something because of SolarWinds, we're thinking of enacting. And I'm getting a lot of pushback from my staff. And so you may back my staff, you may back me. Don't feel obligated to just give us your best. Give me your best.
I'm a natural contrarian, so here we go.
So I won't tell you which side argues what. Okay. I'll say the general thought process is to create a hardware, software inventory list of all of our critical vendors with appliances and open source repositories in order for us that if we see alerts come through, be able to coordinate with those vendors. Agree or disagree with something like that?
Agree. I think where the disagree might come from some people is exposing that out to other people, because essentially at that point you have a threat matrix, right? So right. I could see that argument, but for internal use, I agree.
Because I think that's one of the ways to really address the supply chain, right? Is if I know, let's say, what servers someone is running, or if I know what appliances or software they're using, or what like if it's not proprietary, anything I don't care about proprietary stuff per se, and I can't care about that. Like there is a line in the sand, right, where you kind of have to trust the vendor. That's why I don't like the idea of zero trust, because I think the zero trust concept to me is a buzzword that's flawed to begin with. I don't have a way to verify your proprietary software without one getting you to allow me to do that, and number two, the cost of verifying every single piece of third-party software in your system would be astronomical. It might be your entire security budget in some cases.
I mean, similar with open source, you have more access to the code, so you can scan things and whatnot. But I mean, at some point, there is a certain level of trust.
So one of the things we're looking at is creating a list of open source public appliances and having that for our critical vendors, and hiring a project manager that his entire role is to manage that and communicate with the vendors in the event of a vulnerability, in the event of a 0 day, and kind of get us and let us know that something like this is happening, to allow us to better prepare and develop workarounds within our own security so that we become a little bit more resilient from a security perspective.
Right. So you would tie that kind of inventory into kind of where does that live in your system? And yeah, it's kind of like a internal risk audit of sorts, definitely more technical. But yeah, you're essentially doing an internal audit and by system and like you said, at an even deeper level, you're essentially associating risk, and you'll have that person communicate out whenever something is discovered. I guess that's the kind of the idea. That person is just they're kind of vigilantly watching out for things, and they find something, they report out to the different system owners. Is that kind of the idea?
Right. So the idea is that they would own it, and then they would own it from the vendor relationship as well. So they would touch base with whoever that manager whoever the internal manager is for that vendor. They would both essentially coordinate an immediate call to understand, you guys use this open source repository. These are, some of the weaknesses that have been found that are being reported. Some of those are 0 days, because remember, what we report on, what we read in Bleeping Computer or Thread Post or any of those kind of news sites is when something is finally allowed to be published. So vulnerability could be discovered, and there's a 90-day period where you don't know, where it's not public. There could be threat actors taking advantage of it, but it's not public because you're giving the owner the opportunity to fix it, which is the right thing to do, right? You want to give someone the opportunity to fix it before you go public with it, so that, people don't attack. But then at the same time, in that 90-day window, you're really overly exposed. And if you don't know that they're working on it, if that vulnerability isn't disclosed until, day 91, you've could already been a victim and you don't even know it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that was kind of what I was saying about the privacy space. They have these agreements in place where, a lot of them say things like, you have to inform me within 48 hours, and it's built into the contract. So I think that person would kind of be the product manager you hire would kind of, that would be part of their job, right? Is make sure that they're getting that into the contract, getting those agreements in place. And the other point is, which is a great point, definitely at your scale, is we talk about VRM, right? In my space, where I live in every day, and it's kind of funny. We say VRM because that's kind of where it started. But we quickly, as we started moving up into the enterprise, you quickly realize, right? It's services, and then after that, it was like, no, it's no longer services, it's systems. So we already have some people, some customers already kind of living at that level. I don't necessarily know exactly how they do it. In some cases I do, just because I talk with them, but we already have people kind of living at that level, at the systems level. They don't want to just look at the vendor too high. They don't want to look at which service of that vendor. No, they actually are at the kind of the systems level, looking at what access does the service of that vendor have. So it's kind of like that VRM is kind of even deeper. We've been seeing that already for maybe a few years.
Is it widespread, or is it very specific? Kind of like, these people have a mature program, so they're doing it. Immature programs are less doing it. Are you able to share a little bit about like the differentiation between people that actually kind of are doing it to those that maybe aren't doing it, and why?
Yeah, there's kind of two ways of looking at it. Again, at a high level, what we seem to find out is if it's an older company, say like a company that's been around over 30 years, what you'll see is if they have a mature program, they might be at that level. So with the older company, you'll see the maturity of their VRM program come into play. Whereas what's interesting is a lot of like the fast growing tech companies, they kind of, I guess because of best practices, they kind of research before they get into it. So even though it might be a young company, right, 3-4 years old, they're already kind of at that level. They just kind of start at that level. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And I think it's probably part of it is they know how to make use of technology to where they're not overwhelmed. Because you could understand where a company, 30-year-old company, has literally thousands of vendors. So they're just trying to catch up, right? They've always done it one way, maybe at the vendor level. They've always done it that way. And now they're trying to catch up these thousands of vendors to drive it down into the systems level. Whereas, like I said, a 3-4-year-old fast growing IT company or a SaaS company, right? So, they can start off that way. So they don't have kind of that debt, right? That tech debt, so to speak, of having to now catch up. That makes sense.
It does. It's again, like a lot of stuff in all things in life is about maturity, right? And it's like where you're at in that cycle. And the question is, do you think there's a way, based on what's going on and what's happened with SolarWinds and that sophistication, to where we're able to introduce that earlier on in the maturity life cycle? Because what my concern is this: a small company, but a critical company, starts building something. An attack as sophisticated as what we saw at SolarWinds takes place there. These guys are like wildfire, take over the market. They're in a lot of different, organizations, but because they didn't have the maturity back then, and because typically as you hire along, you're not really looking back. You're more of doing the now and going forward rather than going back. You could have a flawed foundation somewhere, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like there's no winning. Like I think most people who come to security and think like there's a perfect security, there isn't. No. There's always going to be bad guys trying to break in. There's always going to be good guys who fail at protecting their organization, not because they want to, but because that's the nature of the business, right? But there has to be kind of a way where we look at it a little bit differently and adjust slightly to the early on comers. And I did an interview earlier last year at RSA with Michael Marksman. He's the CISO for San Francisco and San Francisco County, for the city and county of San Francisco. And one of the things we were talking about, which has now come to fruition kind of, is the idea that big cities have a lot of resources, meaning you've got really big companies with a lot of resources there. And it's in their interest that their city and county where they operate in don't become victims of cyber attacks.
Right.
So my question was, is there a way to maybe create almost like a non-profit of sorts from those big companies where they would be able to allocate some security resources to help newer companies that are coming into the marketplace? As long as, if like you're sitting up in San Francisco as an example, and you're a small company, you're just getting started, you're a startup, you don't know security, you'd get access to our security center powered by a bunch of these different companies that are based out of San Francisco. Pick a name, it's there, right? Who've allocated some part of a security resource toolbox to allow them to have at least somewhat of a secure foundation beyond just the, how talented your engineers and developers and architects are.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I think, yeah, you're essentially saying how do we expose the unknown unknowns, right?
Right.
So to speak. I think a lot of that has to do with essentially, and I guess maybe they don't even know that they should assess themselves right there. So I think that's a good idea, because if you inform people, hey, you should self-assess. And I'm not proposing a new standard, right? There's already you have the CIS standard questionnaire. You have NIST. They have security questionnaire. I think starting with a self-assessment, because number one, just doing that assessment, you start realize, number one, you say question number 3, you're like, I don't even know what that means. So you're already like, okay, I need to look into this, right? This is something I should be aware of, So there's part of that, and then the second part of that is then you find some gaps, right? And I think if there was kind of an organization in place where you could go confidentially and say, hey, I have either questions about this or I found my gaps, I think that would kind of lift all boats, so to speak, right? I think a lot of times in security, especially, you find that everyone wants to be the uber expert. So I feel like people are kind of afraid to be honest and say like, hey, I might not know about this, or I need help with this, right? So I think I think you're onto something for sure.
Yeah, I wish more people would say I don't know. Like, there's nothing wrong with saying I don't know.
Absolutely.
Like, I respect someone who tells me I don't know. There's a bit of honesty to that. Like, it's okay. And no one's I'm doing this. It's the month of January. It's January 15th. This podcast is going to be live within an hour of you and I recording it. So I started a challenge late last month called InfoSec Hires. Kind of something built off of a LinkedIn Live I do, where I said I want to help 10 people get a job in the month of January, and breaking down the walls and breaking down the barriers, and also beating the ATS systems that disqualifies good candidates because they don't know how to write a resume. Because guess what? Apparently writing a resume is now a skill to beat an ATS system so that you get noticed, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So my challenge, and I'll tell you where I'm getting to with this. There's a reason I'm telling the story. So the challenge for a lot of people is beating through the ATS system. So I said, but there's more power in our community of being discovered than there is an ATS system in a hiring recruiting software like ZipRecruiter, who may want to sponsor the show. So if they're listening, hey, you may want to sponsor, or any other. So yeah. But if you actually look at if we just all shared your profile on LinkedIn, meaning if you did a post and you said, I have X amount of experience doing this, and this is the role I'm looking for, and we all shared it under a similar hashtag, you'd probably get noticed and get a job. Well, 4 people have been hired so far.
Oh, nice.
Right? Out of our goal is 10. We've got 6 more. There's 2 more weeks left to the year. I'm very optimistic that we'll reach and even beat our goal. We've got several people today that messaged me and said I'm on my 3rd interview. So hopefully they get an offer, and next week we can say 2 or 3 more people got jobs. The reason I say that is because there's, like all things, there's a lack of honesty if I don't know, right? So the people that we're helping this month, in the hashtag InfoSec hires, those people, they're willing to come out and say, I don't know. And I respect that. Like, I don't know why I'm not breaking through. Is my CV wrong? Look at it, right? Is my, do I not have the skills? Am I over or under applying for a job? And we in security sometimes, when I coach and I speak to these people, I talk to them a lot about cybersecurity disciplines. And I go, people have to understand that cybersecurity is a very broad term. And under it, there's, I think, like 10 or 12 different disciplines. And people will argue with me about the amount of disciplines, because some people like DevSecOps and AppSec and governance and risk and compliance and privacy and a SOC analyst and pen testing and you name it. Like I said, they're policy, documentation, they're all of those are different disciplines within security. And so when you're a security professional or you're in a company where you're trying to figure this stuff out, you don't have to know everything. There's a lot of disciplines. I, as a CISO, know there are some disciplines I understand very little. I have very little knowledge about. I know I do. So I try to read up and get educated, but I'm nowhere near an expert. And I rely on people who are smarter than me to help. Why do you think that in the supply chain aspect, we can't get to the point where there's that just looking in the mirror and saying, listen, I don't know. You're asking me about 10 different disciplines in your questionnaire, and I didn't even know what 5 of those disciplines are.
I think it's a 2-part thing. It's part of it is there's 2 ways to look at security, or at least people look at it 2 ways. There's people that feel there should be an openness in security, right? People should be open and share their security posture, right? And that's kind of the other side of Whistic. We kind of do that. We have like this security profile where we let people kind of assess and expose that to help people understand. But then there's the other side of security where they kind of believe in, only answer what's been asked. Like, try not to give up information, right? Is this security by obscurity, right? And I think time to time that's just proven it doesn't work, right? Security by obscurity is just not going to work. But I think a lot of people still hold on to that, and whether it's because genuinely it's kind of a procedural thing where that's kind of their policy is like, don't expose things, or it's like I was mentioning earlier, it's just lack of confidence. They're like, we're not sure if we're following best practices here, so it's better, not to say anything. So that's kind of the 2 sides, and obviously, which side we lean on, meaning our company. But I think that's a big part of what we'll have to deal with, is getting people to open up and kind of talk about those things. We're lucky we get to hear our customers, so that's why we kind of understand that we see those 2 sides, because even with Whistic, we see that we try to get people to say like, hey, just go ahead and let your customer know what you're doing here, and they're like, no, we can't do that, right? So if you're not if it's not being discussed and you're not bringing it up, how can you improve it? It's an interesting dilemma.
It's a very interesting dilemma, and it's a dilemma where if it's just because you don't talk about the problem doesn't mean it's not there.
Absolutely.
Right. And I think that's part of the challenge with security. Sometimes we don't want to talk about the pressing problems because we're afraid to go down that route because we realize there's no good solution. But then, like all things in security, there's never a perfect solution. Can you stop all phishing? No, you can't. So we know phishing's a problem. We know it's an attack vector. There's, I think, what is it? Last time I checked, over 270 companies in the industry that do something about phishing.
I didn't realize that.
There's 6,000 cybersecurity vendors, Juan. 6,000 cybersecurity vendors globally. And that doesn't account for like small MSSPs, right? That, maybe work with 20 companies in one county in, Nevada. that no one's ever heard about, but it's there. There's 6,000 cybersecurity vendors right now.
Wow.
That number is probably going to get to 10K within 4 or 5 years.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a hot space.
It's a hot space, and there's a lot of investors looking to jump into this space and willing to, bet some money on some company. And if you don't understand security, you're probably betting on a bunch of companies that, I love the companies that go, we do that, but we do it better. Prove it.
Well, I mean, right now there's someone somewhere pitching their startup and saying that they could have prevented this breach, right?
Yep.
And it's not true, but they're pitching that right now, right?
And there's some investor there going like, wow, you could have prevented this. And he's going to walk around and tell all his friends about it until he tackles a guy like me and you. And we're going to be like, hey, mister, we respect you. We love you. Don't ever say that. Where'd you hear that from? Oh, I'm investing in that one. No, that's not how any of this works.
No, it just doesn't.
It's really not how things work. And it's not to just, I get why people say they could have that. And then there's a cautionary tale of a company who will remain unnamed, because I don't want to dox them or anything like that. But they had a similar claim a few years ago, and they've disappeared off the planet. I think I haven't heard or seen their name in over a year at this point. But let's talk a little bit about this whole kind of your transition from being a software engineer and a developer and an architect, and kind of your career progression to becoming an entrepreneur. Because I think that's most people, when they're a software engineer or an architect working for some of the bigger companies, you make really good money. There's very little incentive to leave that and kind of go down the uncertain path. Tell us a little bit about that path for you. Yeah,
I think I actually had it even a little better, because when I started Whistic, I was already doing contract work. And so, the tax structure was even better. So the pay was definitely very good. But I mean, if I had to trace it back, why I made that leap, quite frankly, I think it really just comes down to watching my parents when I was younger. My parents, they never worked for anyone. Obviously, they have a customer, right? But in their work, they didn't go into a company. They didn't have a boss. So I always kind of picked up on that and realized that they kind of had this sense of freedom about them. And the closest I ever got to kind of that feeling before I started Whistic was working at startups in California. So I worked for 3 or 4 startups in California. And then I went on to work for bigger companies, came over here to oversee work for a bigger company. And eventually you start you feel the weight of the bureaucracy, essentially, right? So for me, it really was just that, trying to get a sense of freedom. And don't get me wrong, I mean, there's a lot of risk involved in that freedom, but I just saw it worth it, That, and I'm big on saving, so I felt comfortable as far as like from a family perspective. I felt we could hold out for 2, 3, 4 years.
I think that's one of the drives of entrepreneurship, right? And in security, one of my goals in Tech Corner this year is to really bring on more of that entrepreneurship, because there's an aspect of entrepreneurship and security where you're jumping into a very hot industry, but there's a lot of challenges with starting a company in the security space simply because of the maturity of the space. So talk a little bit about that that very beginning of the idea for Whistic and some of your early challenges. What was that like?
Sure. I think part of that kind of is kind of my ignorance as a new entrepreneur. I think I didn't realize kind of the competitive landscape, right? But I'll kind of explain that as I kind of tell the beginnings of it. So essentially, when I worked at a big company and worked as an infrastructure architect, part of that is obviously securing the architecture. At that time, the company didn't have like a big security team. They really just focused on kind of network security was involved with network intrusion detection, that kind of thing. So as far as integrations and securing them were involved, that was the job of architecture. And the process as I started learning it was pretty ad hoc. You would get into these situations where a salesperson would come in and say, "Hey, we have this integration, and the contract's closing, in the next couple of days. Can you jump on the phone and talk to them for 5 minutes and assess to make sure they're secure?" And and you're just thrown aback like, oh my goodness, I'm responsible for the system and this integration, and I have 5 minutes to figure it out, right? So quickly, I kind of just essentially felt the pain, so to speak, from an entrepreneurs. They'll hear that, and that's the dog whistle for oh, there's opportunity there, right? Felt the pain, and then so then after I left Whistic, I actually started a different business first, and with someone else, with a couple other people, and I kind of didn't like it. It was kind of outside of my expertise. It was a consumer product, and then at the same time, one of the other people that was part of the startup, he was working for another large company. Directly, they actually had a VRM team, and they were working on it on obviously VRM. And when he left, I asked him, so how was it? He was like, it was awful. All I did was deal with spreadsheets, call people, beg them to return the spreadsheet, and he's like, have you ever tried a version of spreadsheet? Have you ever tried to analyze a spreadsheet and do, check changes between spreadsheets? Like, it's awful. And he also proceeded to explain that the churn for that position was about a year. And as I thought about it, I'm like, that makes sense. These people doing security, they're kind of engineering types, right? Some of them are literal engineers, but not all of them. But they kind of have that mentality. So me as a developer, still at the time, I'm thinking, if I hire an engineer and I tell them, hey, here, fill out all these spreadsheets and send out spreadsheets and review spreadsheets, yeah, I wouldn't be able to keep them for 6 months, right? So that's really where it was like the light bulb came on. Like there is something here, and that was kind of the original vision of Whistic is give back those security people their lives, get them back to doing what they want to do. They wanted security. They don't want to deal with spreadsheets. They don't want to deal in emails. They want to analyze the information. We'll gather it, analyze it, and make a decision. So that's the original vision of Whistic. It's obviously we do a lot more now, but that was
tell our audience a little bit about. I love the early stories of a company because it comes to solve one kind of like really simple but big problem, right? Because when you tell people like, hey, what's the problem with a spreadsheet? My whole job's around a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
You very start to realize I'm one of those sophisticated people. I take my Intel background and I've developed a spreadsheet where you have to answer the same question 6 different times, 6 different ways. And that's one aspect. I think that's like the truth aspect of it. But tell us a little bit about Whistic's platform and kind of how you guys work and what you guys do.
Sure. So obviously now, like I said, it's evolved past the hey, let's just look at a spreadsheet. What's kind of funny is, speaking of the the early days. I'll just kind of tell you what was kind of interesting to me in the early days, which again got me more excited, was we would show this application that I built in 2 months, and people thought it was amazing, and it was because again their interface is a spreadsheet, which is very hard to manage, right? As far as finding things and, like I said, versioning things. So right away I was like, wow, that's pretty interesting that people find this exciting. If they saw the things that are kind of in my head that we're gonna take this, what level we're gonna take this to, they would be blown away. But to answer your question, what does it do today? Essentially today, there's kind of two paths to it, right? There's, like I said, there's kind of two um, um, main kind of customer profiles. There's the mid market, right? That's ramping up quickly. So these are kind of the early stage companies. They kind of have one experience on Whistic, and then there's the enterprise people that have a mature program. They kind of have another experience. So I kind of walk through both of those. So the kind of the early stage people, we essentially have a system in place that where it kind of walks them through to kind of figure out how to set up their program, right? So it asks them about, what are your data types? How do you qualify them? And quite frankly, a lot of them right there, they're like, oh, I should do that, right? So it sets that up. They set up their system. They set up some alerts or some rules for pass fail on vendors, and then we have other integrations. So some people do integrations kind of like for to integrate with their systems, with their flows, so that way all these things get automatically triggered. So they'll set that up. They'll also set up the other end of thing, which is kind of the interface to the vendors. They'll set up automation there, because quite frankly, again, it's going to sound small, but so many people, they get caught up in this constant chase of what's next. You can just set that all up in Whistic, have it all done for you, all automated. And then after that, there's usually, again, for the mid market, there's education around what type of questions you should be asking. Do you want to use a standard questionnaire? Do you want to build out a custom one? You have, like I said, the CIS is like one of the more technical ones that's very in depth. I mean, you're talking about ingress, egress rules, firewall rules. I mean, deep. And then there's other questionnaires where, if you're dealing with like a low risk vendor, you send them kind of a light questionnaire, right? And then there's the custom one, which is kind of what the SolarWinds questionnaire is. We had customers reach out and say, hey, I want to assess all my vendors, and kind of figure out the landscape of my vendors as in regards to SolarWinds. And that one is kind of just a small questionnaire, very much focused on asking pertinent questions for that attack. Because when we looked at it, we said, well, some of these people reaching out to us have thousands of vendors. Do we really want to bombard the internet with these giant questions all at once? So I think we limited it to like 9, and even that there's logic in there, depending on how you answer. Other questions expand. So I think it's as small as 5 or 4 questions if you're not affected, something like that. So that's kind of this. Oh, I didn't finish. So then they send that out. Like I said, they get back the responses from the vendor. At that point, they get to review it. They get to review the documentation and questionnaires, or if we have integrations with other partners, which essentially adds more data points to that review. So then they have a whole set of things they get to review. They once they complete the review, they approve, disapprove, or they can communicate back and forth with the vendor. They have further questions. Like I said, some of these technical ones, that's kind of where it gets kind of interesting. Is depending on how they answer these questions, you kind of know if you need a follow up, so to speak. For example, we have some vendors where they'll ask like simple questions like, I don't know, do you encrypt your hard drive? let's say, and they know the answer is no. Oh, it's game time, right? It's time to dig deep, right? These kind of things. So different people have different strategies, and that's the mid market. The larger customer, it's kind of a similar thing, except they kind of drive the process as opposed to us educating them. They drive the process. They explain their existing process. Sometimes we have our technical team join and kind of help bridge the gap between, okay, you do this manually this way, and the Whistic world is this, almost kind of like if you will, assessment services, so to speak, but for Whistic that describes, bridges that gap, and onboards them in kind of white glove, if you will. But after that, it's all pretty similar, and again, depends on kind of the integration, kind of the level of complexity.
Yeah,
I hope I didn't explain too much there. There's a lot.
No, you didn't. You guys do some awesome stuff, folks. What he was talking about with the SolarWinds, the 9 questions with logic, is what I was mentioning early on in the show in the link below. Whistic.com/SolarWinds is where you can go and you can get this 9-question questionnaire, which I've done, which I know a lot of people have gone and done, and it's been just great. It's eye-opening. It's something very, very effective, I think, that everyone should be doing right now. And listen, there's no need to freak out over SolarWinds, right? Like, the point of the podcast is not to freak you out more over it, but it's to start really addressing that third-party software supply chain challenge that we really didn't think much of, right? We were all so concerned with hardware, right, and endpoints and servers that we've forgotten about how all of those work. And they all work because of some line of code somewhere. And if that line of code has something installed in it that you don't recognize, that's extremely sophisticated, it can cause more damage. And I don't have a good answer. Like, I don't pretend to have any good answers of how to solve this problem. But we do need to start asking those questions. And I think the market creates demand, right? If no one wanted a cell phone, then cell phones wouldn't be a thing. Simple. Yeah. If people didn't like fried chicken sandwiches, then Chick-fil-A wouldn't exist. But people love Chick-fil-A, right? Like, Chick-fil-A and In-N-Out are pretty much the only 2 restaurants that, whenever you go there, there's a line of people. Like, you never go to Chick-fil-A or In-N-Out and go, wow, there's no cars in the drive-thru. Unless they're closed and you're like hallucinating that you're there.
Unless it's Sunday. Yeah.
Yeah. Unless it's Sunday for Chick-fil-A, indeed.
Yeah.
But that's, I think, what I kind of want people to take away from this podcast here as we wrap up, guys, is this isn't we're not trying to create a problem, but we do want to find a way as a community to address it, because I think one of the critical aspects of cyber is it takes a community of everyone pitching in something to create cyber resiliency. And I hate the term of cyber security, like you're ever going to achieve security. You're not going to achieve 100% security. Your best shot based on your organization is to get to where your security incidents are so small that they don't impact operations. So you could have 10 incidents a day, but they're all very, very small. They don't impact operations.
That's mitigation.
Right. That's the resiliency aspect of it, right? Like, something happened on this network. We're able to, shut it down, turn it over, mitigate it, move on. Very little of the business is impacted. I think that's the part where we need to strive for as a community, is how do we find that cyber resiliency? And that cyber resiliency is driven in some buzzwords, but also in some very techniques, in some very good techniques. Defense in depth is one of them, right? Creating multiple layers of defense. I wasn't a deception fan, but I'm now very much a deception fan. I feel like deception technology could be very, very effective. And that's changed over the last 6 months or so. And I think the biggest one is your supply chain integrity. And so, who are my vendors? And a lot of times as a CISO, I'll tell you, Juan, like I'll end up finding 2 replacement vendors for some of our critical vendors that the business unit didn't even think of having like a Rolodex of those vendors, because I know that when something happens, we're going to need multiple backups and we don't have time to research.
Yeah.
Right. So I think like the role of a CISO is evolving. And we talked a little bit about this in the CISO Talk podcast that I'll be publishing on Wednesday next week with Richard Rushing. He's the CISO over at Motorola Mobility. And we talked a little bit about the idea of the office of the CISO and what that's going to look like as the CISO role continues to elevate within companies, but also continues to really break down into the different disciplines, and one of which is going to be the business operation side of security, where you're looking at every single major one of your vendors and you're establishing alternatives and you're studying those alternatives and you're ready to pounce when something happens, because business continuity is going to end up resting on the shoulders of the office of the CISO. What do you think of that one?
No, I completely agree. I think number one, we need to expand into being aware of that chain, right? And understanding where we can add resiliency, how think about ahead of time, think about how would we mitigate certain things, right? We have to build out these almost kind of like war game it, right? Or even if you want to go even deeper, you have to have these design first principles, right? Or like we were talking about earlier, I think yesterday, and think about cleaning up once, going back and reviewing your program and verifying it again. You might have missed something that you didn't even think about 3 years ago, right? You built something out 3 years ago, and the landscape has changed, and now you have to go back and audit that or review it. I think these are all things it'll just grow, right? The responsibility will just continue growing.
Yeah, I mean, now we're seeing the big shift to physical security under the CISO. And that's going to continue. That's going to be that's the trend of 2021. We'll see more and more physical security go, especially after what happened at the Capitol last week. So, you know, if you're a big organization and you're worried about people getting into your company, then that's definitely going to be something you're going to be looking for. And the other aspect of it is going to be the idea of your supply chain and managing your supply chain, and that's going to go away from procurement, and procurement is going to end up being somewhere under the office of the CISO. Because
we're seeing a merging of that. A lot of our integrations are kind of around that.
Yeah, it's that integration between what procurement is working on and what the security needs to do, and how those two are critical for any business application or any business integration to take place. And so we're going to see some really great stuff happening, and I'm excited. Thank you for your support of the podcast. I know we're forever grateful that you guys supported us, and for our listeners and people listening, please make sure to support Whistic and check him out, and it could solve a lot of your problems in your organization, especially if you're a BISO and you're having to fill out 30 of these Excels. You may not ever have to do that again with Whistic. That's that. We do have a webinar coming up, I believe, towards the end of February. I'll be announcing that next week, that we'll be doing a webinar with our friends over at Whistic. So you guys will be able to sign up to that, and we'll have the registration link posted on the bottom of this interview. It won't be today, but it'll be in the next coming weeks. And so, but you'll also be able to see it on our social media following as well. We'll be doing a great little webinar. Not great. It's not going to be little. It's going to be huge. But it'll be an awesome webinar that you guys can also take part of and learn a little bit more. Not a demo, but an actual webinar. So you'll want to tune into that as well. Juan, thank you so much for your time today. I'm really, really grateful.
Thank you.
All right, folks. That's it for our Tech Corner this week. We'll have more coming to you next week. Next week, I'll have my good friend Renee Small and Dr. Dan. We're going to be talking about the psychology and the burnout in cyber. So you guys are going to want to tune into that on Tech Corner next week. You won't want to miss it. Monday, I'll be back with our practitioner briefs live, 9 a.m. live streaming on your favorite social, 9 a.m. Eastern, folks, 9 a.m. Eastern, live streamed on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook. See what I'll be working on next week and see what some of the stuff that's going to be shaping the way our Office of the CISO and my organization operates. Until then, thanks so much for tuning in. Have a great weekend, and most importantly, stay cyber safe.
Make sure to subscribe to our podcast and share it with your friends and colleagues. And get all the latest information at cyberhubpodcast.com.